From the miners who suck rare metals off the seafloor, to the divers working in America's sea sponge capital, we met people around the world who rely on the sea for their livelihoods.
There could be billions of tons of valuable nodules in the ocean. A Canadian startup called The Metals Company could be the first to cash in. And on this test run, it scooped up the world's biggest haul yet. You're looking at a cargo hold full of clumps of metal that formed over millions of years.
This is history. I've never stood in this. No one has. No one.
The CEO says deep sea mining does less damage than mining on land, though no one really knows for sure yet.
Should we be going to dig up our rainforest to get these metals? Or should we be going to this abyssal zone to pick up rocks?
But as the company toasts to a successful pilot mission, environmental activists say deep sea mining is not worth the risks.
We call on you to stop plundering the seafloor.
They say they have leaked video of sediment dumping that proves their point.
Keep it in the ground, just keep it in the ground.
Hundreds of experts have called for a pause on this kind of mining until one of the world's most mysterious ecosystems can be studied further.
Please do the science before you go in and destroy.
Can vacuuming billions of rocks from the deep sea really help power a switch to renewable energy? And is this kind of mining actually any better than mining on land? We went aboard the Hidden Gem to see what mining the deep sea really looks like. These rocks are called polymetallic nodules. If you cut one in half, the inside is kind of like a jawbreaker candy. Each one begins with a fragment, like a shark tooth or shell. Over millions of years, metal particles from the water and sediment build up. A layer just a few millimeters thick can take 1 million years to form. Nodules are found in flat, soft parts of the deep ocean around the world. One of the most promising nodule fields is in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a stretch of Pacific Ocean floor about as wide as the continental United States. Nearly 20 companies and countries are racing to launch the deep sea mining industry here. Much of it is reserved for developing nations, so the Metals Company partnered with 3 Pacific Island countries to be able to explore their plots.
How are you? Jared. Nice to meet you.
Gerard Barron is on a decade-long quest to mine the deep. His last venture ran out of money.
I wanted to do something that was near impossible. You know, I was pretty sure that if I didn't do this, then it may not move forward. And that would be a travesty.
He's the CEO of the Metals Company, which in November finished a 10-week trial run, collecting nodules from the deep.
Today marks one of the most important proof points. The technology is available to collect these rocks at a commercial scale.
Here's how it works. The ship lowers a collector vehicle into the water. This prototype weighs 90 tons and is about the size of a minibus.
Copy.
Operators drive the collector remotely from inside this control room.
Yeah, nodules.
Each vehicle has 4 nozzles and sensors that adjust their positions.
They hover just above the seabed, and the nodules that are laying there are sucked into the nozzle. They work kind of like a vacuum cleaner.
The machine also collects the top few centimeters of mud. Internal pumps separate that from the rocks and shoot some of the sediment back out. Next, air bubbles push rocks, mud, and seawater up a tube that can extend up to 2.5 miles. After about 12 minutes, the slurry reaches the surface. A whirlpool uses gravity to separate the nodules from water and sediment. The Hidden Gem was originally built to drill for oil. The Metals Company and its engineering partner called Allseas retrofitted it to collect and store nodules. The pile in this hold is the expedition's harvest. The company says it's 3,000 metric tons.
This is the first time a commercial collection of this scale has ever been done.
Many rocks break apart on their way up to the ship.
They are quite brittle, but still the product is very valuable for extraction of nickel, cobalt, copper and manganese.
Most of the nodules will stay in storage until the company scales up. The metals company's ultimate plan is to build processing centers at ports that will melt and refine the rocks into separate streams of useful metals. The company wants those facilities to be powered on renewable energy, and eventually plans to recycle battery metals as well. But first, it needs permission from the International Seabed Authority to scale up mining. Some have criticized that process, saying approval to explore mining in the first place has been rushed and secretive. But the CEO says this mission will provide insights about mining that you can only get by mining.
If you're going to move an industry from an idea into commercial production, you need to do this. All of this data is going to be so important as we build a picture and prepare our finalized environmental impact study.
Researchers hired by the metals company sail alongside the mining ship in this science vessel. They're taking samples before and after harvesting to see how kicking up clouds of sediment or creating lots of noise affects the deep sea environment.
I sometimes hear our critics say, but how can we trust the science if you're paying for it? I say to them, well, who's going to pay for it? If I'm not going to pay for it, I'm sure you're not either.
The company's environmental impact statement based on this mission is expected in the second half of 2023. And one of the main questions is what to do with the water and sediment sucked up with the nodules. The metals company is still testing out the right depth to minimize the impact of sediment clouds, but estimates it's below 1,200 meters. If it's closer to the surface, it can block sunlight to sea life below and spread to a wider area. Activist groups shared these video clips with Insider. They say it shows the hidden gem spilling wastewater onto the surface. The metals company responded with their own video, saying it was a temporary overflow from the whirlpool, which it says ran over the deck and out of these pipes. In an email, the company said the event did not have the potential to cause harm. Insider could not verify whether the videos show the same event. Experts told us loose sediment could impact sea life down below.
These are like the most clear waters probably on the planet. So somebody dumping a lot of sediment in there that the animals are not used to probably will have some impact. So we actually don't really know how much they can withstand.
Okay, and how many meters are you behind the collector?
24 meters.
A promotional video from the metals company calls this mining area
a vast underwater desert.
But even deserts have life in them, and this stretch of seafloor does too. Many of the species in the dark, high-pressure habitat haven't been found anywhere else on Earth. Recent expeditions have found a never-before-seen octopus, a swarm of eels eating bait, plus sea cucumbers, fish, and stuff we didn't even have a name for yet. Like this thing with nearly 7-foot-long tentacles. It's attached to a sponge stalk, which is stuck on a nodule. That's a key detail. The rocks seem to give some creatures on the soft seafloor something to hold on to. So no matter how careful the miners are not to stir up sand, removing nodules would take away key habitat and likely kill any animals attached to them.
We can't really predict the scale of species extinctions that would come from that much mining, but there's reason to think it could be significant.
We don't actually know enough yet to understand all these impacts and therefore the costs.
What we do know is that mining metals on land can have devastating effects. The cobalt rush in the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been linked to human rights abuses, including the use of child labor. In Indonesia and the Philippines, nickel mining operations led to the deforestation of tropical areas. But some mines are managed better than others.
People promoting deep sea mining often argue that all land-based mining is inherently badly managed. And that's not true. There are certainly many cases where it is, but there are certainly many cases where it's not.
Ores mined on land also leave behind lots of leftovers, called tailings. These can leach dangerous pollution into water and soil if not disposed of properly. The CEO believes seafloor mining solves that waste issue and has other benefits too.
We generate zero waste and zero tailings. We don't have the risk of any child labor. We can commercially pick up these rocks and help stop some of the terrible deforestation of our most biodiverse habitats on land.
That would mean replacing some land-based mining with deep-sea mining. But experts say there's no evidence land-based mining would go away or even decline if we mine the seafloor.
You'll just end up with a situation that you are going to have increased ecological harm on land and then at sea as well.
Hidden gem, hidden gem, hidden gem.
On November 16th, a Greenpeace campaigner radioed the mining ship at sea to tell the crew his concerns.
Deep sea mining is an imminent threat to the ocean and the vast array of wondrous marine life.
The activist says the environmental benefits the company touts are just marketing spin.
The argument that we need to look for these minerals and metals to aid the green energy transition is pure greenwash. We're not talking about reducing the overall amount of mining. We're talking about already wealthy people looking for a new gold rush.
Ultimately, experts say mining always has trade-offs, no matter where you do it.
There's no question that deep-sea mining would have major environmental impacts, but whether those are acceptable trade-offs is a decision society has to make.
Experts told Insider the best way to make that decision is by starting small.
To start with one mining operation and monitor it very well for at least 10 years. And my personal view is that probably it could sustain one mining operation without having major regional loss of ecosystem services and biodiversity. But people are not talking about one mining operation.
Right now, 22 companies and governments have contracts to explore deep-sea mining in international waters. The metals company says it could begin full-scale operations as soon as 2025. To shift away from fossil fuels, energy experts say we need metals for batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines now.
I don't think deep sea mining would ever be able to be a substantial producer. So the question is that niche, that boutique sort of fraction of the market, is it worth the risk?
The International Energy Agency says that to avoid the worst effects of climate change in coming decades, the world needs to mine at least 4 times as many metals as it does now. Nodules could help with that, but we'll still need a lot of metals from land and a lot more recycling.
By some estimates, about 70% of the natural sea sponges collected globally come from this stretch of Florida's coastline. Generations of residents, many Greek, have built their lives around this foamy sea creature.
I don't know how to do anything else.
Sponge divers here have harvested these animals, yes, they're animals, since the 1900s. But the industry has been struggling recently. Increasingly frequent hurricanes have prevented fishermen from heading out to sea. Some of those storms even killed the sponges. And high fuel costs over the last year have turned some away from working in the industry at all. But sponge diving has faced challenges in the past and has bounced back before. Sponge sales still bring in a couple $1 million a year. But Tarpon Springs has found another way to leverage its storied history.
It supports probably close to $20 million worth of tourism.
We head to Florida's Gulf Coast to find out how sea sponges became such a big business and why divers are fighting to keep their trade alive. Anastasios Charistinos arrived here from Greece in the early 1970s. The 70-year-old now goes by Captain Tasso.
His name is Tasso Charistinos.
Ocean is, I feel like my house, home for me.
And we ended up in Tarpon Springs. Greek town, Greek music, Greek restaurants, so I fit into a place.
Sponge diving dates back to ancient Greece. In fact, both Homer and Aristotle wrote about the creatures. Back then, people used them for bathing, cleaning, painting, and decorating, the same as today. When settlers found natural sponge beds in Florida in the 1800s, Greeks began making their way to America, bringing their trade with them. In the olden days, they'd wear suits like this. But nowadays, divers wear wetsuits in the summer and insulating dry suits in the winter, and they strap on scuba masks and shoes.
I've worn anywhere from football cleats to try to basically grip the bottom to run a little faster, to construction boots, to deck boots, to scuba boots.
I use no tools. The only thing I got a knife and cut it off. That's it. Knife.
They plunge as low as 60 feet deep to find the sponges.
Hardly ever it will go over 45, 50, 60 feet maybe.
They walk along the bottom for as long as it takes to fill up one bag.
I just keep looking. I just make a lot of dives. I go down and I look.
In the old days, they used a hook to tear sponges from the bottom. But now, by law, a diver has to cut the sponge with a knife to promote regeneration. One study shows cut sponges have a much better chance of surviving, roughly 30% higher than hooked ones. It's kind of like shearing a sheep or cutting a branch off a tree. Sponges actually show the highest regenerative ability of any animal. Still, Captain Tasso doesn't harvest the smaller ones. He leaves them behind so they can keep growing.
They have to be 5 inches and up.
They haul their full net up to the boat and make their way back to shore.
Eh? Ναι, αλλά η σακούλα μέσα είχε 2 οκτάρια, είχε και ένα για χθες.
On the docks, Tasso and his team get to work, separating and cleaning the sponges.
The price of the sponges depends on the size of the sponges and the quality.
Wool sponges are the most valuable, going for about $15 each. They're the softest and they hold a lot of water. Yellows are more coarse. They're also the cheapest. As the fishermen sort the sponges, they give them the first of many cleanings. Then they trim them to get rid of any discolorations and to shape them.
That's the reason I'm wearing the gloves, because sponges like a fine sandpaper, they wear you out, you know, the fingerprints disappear, see? Just like glass. I almost dropped my coffee cup this morning, you know?
Overnight, Captain Tasso leaves his clean sponges out to dry. Some people stop by to ask questions or buy straight from the harvesters on the docks, but Tasso says the best option is finding a wholesale buyer. The sponges find themselves, or rather a piece of themselves, at a processing plant, like this one, about 1.5 miles from the docks. Sponges get soaked in the wetting area and pushed down into a bath with a wooden paddle. Then they're drained in this net and transferred to a water extractor, where they're spun to remove excess water, leaving the sponges damp and ready for the next stage, cutting. The worker protects his fingers from this sharp wire with gloves.
These are sponges that are netted up for processing. We'll put them in the bath tonight and they'll sit there overnight and then be processed from there.
Harry Barber manages the plant at Armley Sponge Company. The Armley family founded the company in the Bahamas in 1908 and expanded into Florida about 50 years ago. They opened their Tarpon Springs processing plant in 2018. Into the washing machine they go. Next, time to dry and get sorted by size. They box the sponges and prepare them for shipment.
Bath sponges have taken off tremendously because people want to use something on their children that's sustainable and, clean and natural.
Despite the sponge's near magical ability to regenerate, it was almost wiped out here in the late 1930s by a mysterious disease. And then again in the 40s and 50s, Out-of-control algae, called red tides, killed many local sponge beds. The population survived against all odds and thrived during the industry's heyday in the 1980s, when around 30 sponge boats and 50 divers docked here every day.
It was a blight of sponges in the Mediterranean, and we were able to harvest here locally at higher prices and ship stuff over to the Mediterranean.
But when the Mediterranean fisheries recovered, the demand and the price went down again in Tarpon Springs. Many fishermen went out of business, but some, like Captain Tasso, stuck it out.
And I don't know how to do anything else.
2022 hasn't proven much easier. With record inflation and fuel prices, maintaining and gassing up a boat is expensive. And the industry is facing another problem. Hurricanes are happening more and more because of the climate crisis, so bad years are becoming the norm. Divers can't go out during storms, but there's something else. Even though sponges are technically animals, they survive by attaching themselves to the ocean floor. During a hurricane, many get smothered by sand or hit by tumbling rocks and die. Lately, only a handful of sponge boats and about a dozen divers go out any given day.
You just have to look harder because it's not everywhere general like used to be. A red tide kill them, but some survivors here or there.
Captain Tasso works long days.
I work all my life. I grew up in a family, 12 kids. My father take me up 4 o'clock in the morning, working all day long. I can work 24 hours non-stop.
Handling his sponges the whole time.
From the time you pick the sponge on the bottom, that's the first time you touch it. By the time you sell it, you have touched the same sponge at least 20 more times.
Armely mostly buys from independent contractors like Tasso.
We purchase from them based on what they bring in and the conditions and sizes of what they have.
So the income isn't guaranteed. Sponger Muhip Goktepe goes on these long fishing trips year-round. He makes about $46,000 a year.
If you bring sponges, it's gonna be good year. You don't bring them, no good year. Sometimes hurricane, tropical storm, you don't work.
Some years you work more and you make more. Some years less and you make less. Depends how much time you're going out there, that's all.
In addition to the financial uncertainty, diving can be dangerous if your hose gets cut or you dive too deep. That's why Muhip and Tasso aren't trying to pass down a family business.
Well, cut my air hose a couple of times and I run out of air and I have to swim up. That's a dangerous stuff.
I don't want my kids or my grandkids to do this job. They can do better, you know what I mean?
There's not much money into it. Nobody wants to go get beat up out there for 20 days. People prefer to be in the land. I ain't gonna push my grandkids to this job. I don't want them to do that. They're doing good in the school.
It is sad to see so few fishing, but I certainly understand it. The markets right now won't bear really high prices to offset the cost of fuel. Maintenance on boats is expensive. We're looking at a country and a world that's trying to look at natural products.
So until the industry can rejuvenate itself, Tarpon Springs will have to rely on its tourism. Visitors pour tens of millions of dollars into the community every year, eating authentic Greek food and taking boat tours. They also shop for sponge souvenirs to take home. But many locals wonder if tourism will be the long-term solution, and if it's not, what's next for the upcoming generation of spongers?
In 2012, a teenager came up with an ambitious plan to eliminate plastic in the ocean. Boy and Slat wanted to harness natural currents to collect floating debris inside a giant U-shaped barrier.
I believe the Great Pacific Garbage Patch can completely clean itself in just 5 years.
That timeline didn't work out. And there's still a garbage truck's worth of plastic entering the ocean every minute on average. But the ocean cleanup has made progress. The nonprofit has removed more than 200 metric tons of trash from the Pacific.
Many people said that it couldn't be done, that it was a fool's errand, a pipe dream.
But to really make a dent in plastic pollution, the organization's going closer to the source. Most ocean plastic comes from rivers. So the Dutch entrepreneur invented these big machines that capture waste before it ever makes it to open waters.
Rivers are the arteries that carry the trash from land to sea.
They're called interceptors, and the founder plans to deploy 1,000 of them. But some experts worry these machines could strip rivers and oceans of things that are supposed to be there too. So, can a network of trash barriers clean the world's most polluted rivers? And are cleaner rivers the key to a plastic-free ocean? The Rio Osama in the Dominican Republic flows into the Caribbean Sea. It's one of the dirtiest rivers in the world, and Carmen Encarnacion has lived nearby for 24 years.
Nos afecta emocionalmente, es decir, nos afecta de toda la manera.
The ocean cleanup installed an interceptor about a mile down the river from her home in 2020.
El río está más limpio, ahí se siente menos contaminación.
The idea is to let the current do most of the work. As trash travels downstream, this 700-foot-long arm redirects it toward the machine's opening.
So what the barriers do is they let the water pass, but they stop everything that's floating. On the roof, we have these solar panels that are connected to batteries, which store the energy so that even at night we can keep intercepting plastic.
Conveyor belts carry the waste to one of 6 dumpsters. They can fill up in just 3 days during the rainy season. A lot of today's haul is plants. And in this case, that's probably not a bad thing. These are invasive water hyacinths. They grow naturally in the Amazon, but over the past century, humans have introduced them to new places where they don't have any predators. Like the Osama River, where they're taking over, blocking light and oxygen and killing plants and animals beneath them. The plant tends to thrive in polluted water, and its roots cling to trash.
Todos esos desechos tóxicos que botan se quedan enredados en esa planta.
Nearby factories and farms have used this river as a dumping ground for decades. But in Santo Domingo, many people who live on the Osama's banks depend on it for drinking water. A lot of them also have limited options for dealing with waste.
It has to do with urban planning, and if these communities here don't have the access roads for the trucks to come in.
So some locals dump their trash in drainage ditches called cañadas.
So right behind me we have the Cañada Bonavides. It's one of the worst cañadas we have here in the Osama River. Just like the rivers are the arteries that take the plastic to the ocean, these cañadas here are the arteries that take the plastic to the river.
The ocean cleanup estimates the Osama carries up to 22,000 metric tons of plastic into the Caribbean Sea each year. The nonprofit has 10 other interceptors in rivers around the globe. The devices can't remove all types of pollution, like chemicals or plastic that doesn't float. And until residents have more options for dealing with trash, it'll keep ending up in the Osama.
We rely heavily on working with local partners, such as the Dominican Navy here or the UNDP, precisely to work on this upstream problem.
The Navy handles day-to-day operations for the river cleaner. And it works with the national government to manually collect trash that slips by the interceptor.
They have proven to be the perfect partners for us. By the end of the year, they should be owning the interceptor.
Once that happens, the ocean cleanup will shift its focus to other rivers, like the Rio Motagua in Guatemala, which the nonprofit says might have more plastic than any other in the world.
In Guatemala, there's so much trash coming down the river that these machines would be filled within a few seconds. So there, again, we have a different type of interceptor.
The nonprofit built an interceptor fence to catch plastic in a flash flood zone that flows into the river.
Every river is unique. You really need to adapt it to the specific circumstances of that river.
The fence lets some plastics through, but Boyne expects to have an updated interceptor by the end of 2023. Meanwhile, the founder hasn't given up on his initial dream, cleaning the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. He founded the Ocean Cleanup in 2013, and a decade later, the patch is still growing. One challenge is that it isn't really a patch. It's actually 2 swirling clouds of debris, which often aren't visible on the surface. Natural currents have created 5 whirlpools like it around the world, called gyres, and each one collects trash. The nonprofit is working on cleaning up the North Pacific Gyre using this thing, It's a flexible barrier stretched between two ships, with a shallow screen hanging off. The idea is to consolidate floated plastic, making it easier to collect about once a week. The ocean cleanup says in total it's removed more than 200 metric tons of plastic from the Pacific Gyre. Yet it's only about 0.2% of all the plastic that might be floating here. The team is working on a system 3 times bigger than this one, which should be ready sometime in 2023. Some researchers worry these cleaning machines can disrupt ecosystems by scooping up living things along with trash. The ocean cleanup says the screen creates a downward flow that carries living creatures under it. But the system still catches some fish, crabs, barnacles, and other animals. The nonprofit says it's continually fine-tuning the device to try to keep creatures out, but it's impossible to avoid them completely. That's partially because sea life is all mixed up with the plastic and can even live right on it.
Sea urchins, sea stars, pretty much anything that you can imagine, you can also find on these plastic floats. There's a lot of organisms that also attach their eggs to these floating plastics.
Some critics say the whole idea of passively harvesting plastic is risky.
Once it is in the ocean, it is connected with marine life. It's too late to remove it.
A potential alternative is targeting clusters of trash instead of sweeping the whole gyre.
Plastic in the open ocean tends to form these plastic dust bunnies at sea. Collecting the plastic debris is also pretty easy once it's clumped into these dust bunnies, because then you have a single targeted area with an extremely high amount of plastic.
Those clumps are mostly fishing gear, which does the most damage.
By focusing on things like ghost gear, which are really, really dangerous to marine life, you're collecting the most harmful plastic out of the ocean, not necessarily collecting some of the less harmful plastic, things like laundry baskets or buckets, which may have a lot of life growing on them.
The ocean cleanup says that in the long run, its ocean systems will be more scalable than manual cleaning. When it comes to its river cleanup, experts were more optimistic.
I loved it in the diagrams, how it sort of funnels it in. I was like, that is so perfect. Once it's in the ocean, it's a problem that really becomes much harder to manage.
That tracks with Boyan's results. As of April 2023, his team has collected more than 10 times as much plastic from rivers as from the ocean. In Santo Domingo, members of the Dominican Navy empty the dumpsters and send the haul to the Duquesa landfill.
Of course, landfill is not ideal, but at least it's 1,000,000 times better than it flowing into the ocean.
Boyan says the river plastics can't be recycled as easily as the ones from the ocean.
It's much more of a mix, and also it's much more polluted. So you have sewage water that's often in these rivers.
Ultimately, restoring a polluted ecosystem requires big changes. The best way to keep plastic out of rivers and oceans is to make less of it.
Everybody can do something, but we also need the companies to do their part. This needs to be a collaboration between all sectors of society.
In the meantime, Carmen does what she can to clean up her own neighborhood. In her free time, she collects water hyacinths and transforms them into art.
La teníamos ahí mismo y no sabíamos qué hacer con ella. Y eso me motivó a ir desenvolviendo, a ver la curiosidad de qué tipo de cosas se podían hacer con ella.
She dries the plant and weaves it into hats, bags, and more.
Hay muchos tipos de decoraciones y ahí podemos portar con lo que es eliminando la contaminación.
Much like plastic, the plant can be useful, but Carmen still wants to see it gone.
Entonces, si la humanidad no se une y coopera con lo que es el reciclaje, va a seguir lo que es la contaminación.
Royal Caribbean's Symphony of the Seas is like a giant floating city. And its residents, over 6,000 passengers a week. It can cost over $1 million a day to keep it all running, even though each cruiser pays as little as $100 daily. So to make a profit, the cruise line and all its crew have to be really efficient. It takes a staff of 2,400 people hustling to keep it all operating smoothly.
So we cover day and night productions.
The team moves supplies along secret crew member-only areas of the ship. From cramped ship kitchens, chefs pump out 30,000 meals every single day.
Very, very good. So this is what
A bustling trash room handles all the waste, and the captain's bridge keeps the ship moving safely.
Like, wow, it's really crazy. The productions are super massive.
We go behind the scenes to see what it takes to sail one of the world's largest cruise ships. Symphony of the Seas was the globe's biggest ship for 4 years running. In 2022, the Wonder of the Seas took the title, beating out its older sister because it's slightly heavier. Back in late 2019, we boarded Symphony for a week to film all the happenings inside. The voyage started on a Saturday. This is turnaround day. Passengers disembark so new ones can board.
We don't get people in and out gradually, we just do everything at once.
And every room is turned over.
As you may imagine, it's a big job to clean 2,759 rooms.
On turnaround day, trucks carrying 500 pallets of new inventory arrive at the Port of Miami, the busiest cruising port in the world. Among these provisions, over 600,000 pounds of food and beverages that get loaded on to Deck 2.
This is basically a place that you would not like to be on turnaround day when we are loading. It's busy, super busy.
It's estimated the top 3 cruise lines in the world will spend an estimated $2.3 billion on food and drink in 2023. Supplies have to be perfectly planned for this 7-day cruise.
Our ability to manage the things with our own resources needs to be much bigger than in a hotel where at sea there's no option.
And all this has to be loaded onto the ship in just 9 hours.
Any delay in our operation can hamper the sail away of the ship, which is again a big logistic requirement.
By 4:30, the ship is ready to set sail. Moving the ship is a combined effort between the bridge and the engine control room. The bridge handles steering and navigating.
Maybe only 10% of my job is being on the bridge, having control of the ship. The rest of it, I'm managing a huge operation.
And the engine room provides the power.
I always say that when there's a problem on board, the captain calls me, I never call the captain.
4 bow thrusters move the front of the ship side to side, and 3 electric azopod propellers turn 360 degrees to pull the ship instead of push it. 6 giant engines power it all.
We have everybody on board. Then he will request to have propulsion and start the thrusters and get ready for departure. So the engines are almost ready. So we have 1 and 6 online.
Now Captain Sullivan can maneuver out of the port.
Here we are on the bridge in the cockpit. This is where we do the navigation at sea. We've got multiple displays giving us information about the ship, what the course, the speed, the heading is. We have an electronic chart display with our routes already planned, and we can see exactly where we are at any time.
Symphony of the Seas is registered and sails under the flag of the Bahamas. Because of the Passenger Services Act of 1886, no foreign flag ships can move passengers between 2 U.S. ports. To avoid the $200 per passenger fine, any Royal Caribbean ship leaving the U.S. has to stop at another country. Since this cruise is headed to Puerto Rico from Miami, they had to slip St. Martin and the Bahamas into the itinerary. On the other side of the ship, passengers are getting settled into their rooms. Ocean View cabins start at $1,000 per person for the week, going up to $85,000 for the tricked-out Ultimate Family Suite.
We have a room for every wallet on this ship. Everything good? Amazing, huh?
Meaning hotel manager Fernando Jorge has to cater to all kinds of tastes.
If you put this jacket on with 4 stripes, you'll be a celebrity too.
Cruise lines bank on the fact that they have a captive audience for a week. They make their profit from keeping passengers moving through the ship, dropping cash on onboard purchases, like alcohol, casino games, and specialty restaurants. Fernando says the ship's design helps. On conventional cruise ships, there's only one block with a big pool in the middle. This ship has 7 distinct neighborhoods with their own themes and activities. A big central park sits in the middle, and 17 public and private pools and hot tubs dot the rest of the ship. The average cost to build a new ship is $650 million. Royal Caribbean spent more than double that on the Symphony of the Seas. Fernando's goal is to control how passengers move through the ship, from their rooms to shows to dining halls, so no one part is too overcrowded.
They move around freely to their own will and doing what they want, but we, up to a certain extent, the flow is designed that at any given point you do not feel that you are with another 6,500 people on board.
The ship's design also helps in isolating zones in case of an emergency and controlling COVID-19. Passengers that test positive for COVID can be quarantined down on Deck 3.
So this is a COVID quarantine. You guys on Deck 3. Thing is, they leave these disinfectant bottles. All our trash in these biohazard bags. Our meals, our room service, anything like that, we put it in those bags. Hand sanitizer, masks. When you have COVID, they send you to the cabin. Room service is pretty much complimentary. So they are not directly handing you the food. They're putting it down and then you pick it up and stuff like that.
In December 2021, 50 people on board tested positive for COVID. They were able to isolate in their cabins. Every crew member is trained on COVID procedures and sailing safety. Royal Caribbean is incorporated in Liberia. Labor laws there are a lot looser than in mainland United States or Europe. It allows Royal Caribbean to hire a crew from all over the world and keep them working long hours for 3 to 12-month contracts. Half of the staff is part of Fernando's culinary team. Their job? Feeding all those passengers their 3, 4, 8 meals a day.
You have to calculate that it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, plus snacks, plus at night, plus all 24-hour food all around, and that never stops.
Ship kitchens run 24/7, manned by a culinary team of more than 1,000 people. They dish out over 30,000 meals every single day, and they do it all from compact kitchens on a rocking ship. So how does all this food make it to the plate? Jared's in charge of ordering all the food for the ship's 23 different restaurants. Every week, Jared's got a $1 million shopping budget. All of that is just for 7 days of food. Sometimes Jared will tweak his orders based on who's coming aboard. More kids means more chicken fingers.
That's how the operation runs. So we monitor it on a daily basis, what has been used, what has not been used, and then we adjust our orders accordingly. But by and large, being in Miami, having the same number of people, it's almost the same every cruise.
Once on board, everything is moved along the ship's secret highway. This is I-95, and it runs the entire length of the ship, on Deck 2.
We separate all the stores to the different locations that they are supposed to go. We have about 20 different storerooms divided into freezers, fridges, walk-in fridges, and dry stores.
Seafood, meat, vegetables, and fruit are all divided and stored in separate fridges.
If you come towards the end of the cruise, this box will be almost empty with a few fruits that are needed for 2 more days, which we keep as backup stock.
There are also 6 freezers. That's where the 700 pounds of ice cream that'll be eaten each week are stored. Dry goods are stored down on Deck 1.
Full of spices, full of chocolate in this storeroom. Coffee. It's nice to be in this storeroom.
An elevator gets the food downstairs. Jared's team checks all of the food for quality control every day. If produce is ripening faster than expected, they try to work it into another meal. For example, overripe broccoli could go into broccoli cheddar soup instead of being tossed. Once inventory is stored, restaurants on upper decks put in food orders with Jared. Chefs will come downstairs, pick up their order, and cart it away to be cooked. That's where this guy comes in.
Any food on board this beautiful ship, anything you eat, is my responsibility. Wherever you have beautiful potato fry, it's mine. Rice is mine. Pate is mine. Pastry is mine. Salad, shrimp, wherever you eat it, is my responsibility.
Rijo's team of 280 chefs run the kitchens 24/7. Each chef works 10 to 12-hour days. Contracts typically last 4 months without a single day off.
Some of the people start to working for 8 o'clock in the morning, all the way to 2 o'clock, take a break, come back again 5 o'clock, finish by 9:30. Then other group start to working 10 o'clock in the night, all the way to 10 o'clock in the morning. So we cover day and night productions.
Chefs on board cook up nearly 100 different menus every week. All the menus are developed at Royal Caribbean's Miami headquarters. And every week, chefs stick to the same rotation of menus, cooking up everything from racks of lamb to hand-rolled sushi. The food has to be diverse to match Symphony of the Sea's international passengers, vacationing at all kinds of price points.
We try to please everybody and to make sure that everybody find what you're looking for.
All the cooking happens in 36 kitchens, or galleys as they're called on a ship. There are 12 specialty restaurants on board, costing up to $50 a person. And each of those restaurants has its own small galley. In those tight quarters, chefs crank out the same menu every day. At Jamie's Italian, it's fresh pasta. At Hooked, it's over 2,000 oysters, shucked per cruise. But the largest amount of food is reserved for the main dining room, which spans 3 decks and serves up to 6,000 people a night. Eating here is included in your ticket. Before food heads up to the main galleys, it starts in one of the prep kitchens, off I-95. There's a butcher shop.
Butcher, good morning. These are the gentlemen looking after all the meat cuts.
The butcher goes through about 15,000 pounds of beef and 9,700 pounds of chicken each week. There's also a veggie cutting room and a fish thawing box. Lobster is the most popular dish in main dining. The ship goes through about 2,100 pounds of lobster tails every week. Finally, the food heads upstairs to the main galley. The ship's biggest kitchen is broken down by categories: desserts, bread, cold food, and hot food. In dessert, chefs whip up cakes, chocolates, and 100 different types of pastries. Over in the bread bakery, they make 40 different kinds of bread from all over the world, all from scratch. But the real hustle comes just before the dinner rush. 6,000 hungry passengers in the main dining room. Remember Rijo? Before dinner prep starts, he has to approve all the dishes.
Good afternoon. How are you, Chef? Good.
Rijo tries each dish and gives his critiques.
We're gonna put a little bit more ferno, a little bit more garlic, a little bit more herbs. Very, very good. So this is what we're looking for. Aioli. Aioli, we need to put a little bit more for today. Huh? You can see, Chef, how we look. Huh? Take a note, don't forget. That's what we're talking about, right? Beautiful, beautiful. We don't have any challenge, so we're ready to go. Great. Chef, thank you so much, and thank you so much, and look forward to have a beautiful night tonight. Thank you. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.
Chefs take his notes and get cooking. Chefs can see a tally of each dish ordered up on screens. The system also keeps track of how much inventory is used. In the cold room, salads and appetizers like carpaccio come together. In the hot room, chefs dish out soups, sauces, sides, and mains.
We have 2 kinds of chefs. Chefs working here on the line, which is close to me, plating up, and chefs on the stove cooking. So everything we do is in batch cooking. So basically, we grill a steak there, we pass it over to the pass. The person on the pass is plating it up to the requested temperature. That means always that the guests are getting fresh food, and from an operational point, we don't have any overproduction.
Finally, waiters deliver those dishes to hungry passengers out in main dining. Between the chefs, inventory crew, waiters, and dishwashers, it takes a team of 1,085 people to keep this massive operation going. Together, they cook nearly 11 million meals each year, and they're doing it all on a moving ship.
The ship is rocking, then all the equipment is built to the ship rocket. Then in whatever moment, maybe the ship moves, somebody don't put one brake in one trolley, and you see the trolley flying away. And happen. That's why all the cooks always be the attention with that.
But if crew members are doing their job right, passengers won't even know any of it's happening. They'll just get back to eating their 8th meal of the day. What happens to all that leftover food and other waste on the ship? Well, it's handled by the ship's waste management team. But there aren't any garbage trucks here to scoop it up and take it away. We're at sea, obviously. And since waste can't, and shouldn't, just be dumped in the ocean, well, what do cruise ships do with all of it? This is something the industry's been dealing with for years.
Carnival Cruise Line is coming clean about polluting oceans.
Princess Cruises was fined $40 million in 2016 for illegal dumping, and Carnival got hit with a $20 million fine in 2019 for disposing of plastic waste in the ocean.
Carnival Corporation's issues really brought the need for better technology so that these ships can operate more efficiently.
Cruise lines have been working on systems to purify water and deal with waste inside ships.
Up until now, these types of options weren't available.
All this tech was custom built for the Symphony of the Seas. The company says it's a zero landfill ship, which means it uses everything from recycling to water filtration to deal with its own waste. And this guy is in charge of making sure no single water bottle is unaccounted for.
Welcome to Waste and Recycling Center.
We're down on deck 2, that secret crew-only area of the ship. Crew members check all the ship's trash cans for recyclables and bring them down here for Alex's team to handle. Despite being the only waste facility on this massive ship, it's surprisingly quiet. Alex said the busiest time is in the morning, when things are unpackaged for the day.
This is the waste streams that we have. Every waste stream has its own way of handling it.
There are separate teams to deal with each incoming recyclable: glass, cardboard, plastic, and metal.
This is our incinerator room. So we have 2 incinerators, 1 and 2. This area is manned 24 hours a day. We have 10 crew members who are working here, 5 in the morning and 5 in the evening.
Crew members separate glass into colors: green, brown, and white.
See, this is the byproduct of it after we crush it.
They can process upwards of 13,000 pounds of glass for a week-long cruise. All the small glass pieces are stored in bins until the ship docks. Plastic goes through this massive compactor. Even though the ship's gotten rid of plastic straws, it still relies on bottled water, because for health and safety reasons, no cruise ship is allowed to have water fountains. So every week, they crush about 528 gallons of water bottles.
We are compacting the cardboard over there.
Throughout the day, cardboard is stacked up in this machine, called a baler. Once it's full, it's all compressed into bundles. And used aluminum cans, well, they're sent through this baler. The machine squeezes them down into big cubes, which are then stored in a fridge just off the waste room.
This area is actually for the items that can produce smell, the garbage.
And that smell could get pretty bad. The waste is stored for up to 7 days at a time, until the ship docks back in Miami, where all the plastic, aluminum, paper, and glass go to recycling partner facilities. In 2018, Royal Caribbean recycled 43.7 million pounds of waste. And any rebates earned from these recycling programs go back to the Employee Retirement Fund. The cruise line is hoping that it's a nice incentive for employees to bring recycling down from their own crew cabins. So what about things that can't get recycled? For example, food. Every week, the ship loads up 600,000 pounds of provisions. But for the food that's not eaten, well, the company had to figure out how to get rid of all of that, too. Each one of the ship's restaurants and 36 kitchens has its own suction drain. Chefs and waiters keep food scraps in separate buckets. Then, once they've gotten enough, they place it all in this special drain. All the food waste ends up in one big pipe that runs through the entire ship. And that pipe leads to what's known as the hydroprocessor.
Those pipes over there, so these were the food waste is passing through. This is being processed through here.
This machine has a bunch of tiny layers of mesh to break down the food.
It's being stored in our tank. We have 2 tanks of comminuted food waste.
And the final step, incineration. Now let's talk about your toilet waste. Yep, we're gonna go there. It's all part of the water treatment system on board, controlled from the engineering room.
All the wastewater that we are generating on board the ship is being collected. Nothing goes overboard unless we have run it through a treatment plant.
Water is divided into 2 categories: gray water, from sinks, laundries, and drains, and black water. That includes everything from the galleys and your toilets, including your urine.
This is then being mixed together and run through the advanced wastewater purification plant.
The purification system purifies the water to a point above the US federal standard, which is almost safe to drink.
And then it runs several filtration processes before it's being kept on board or it's being discharged overboard when we are at sea with a certain distance from land in order to meet the different local and international regulations.
And onboard filtration systems produce about 150,000 liters of drinkable water every hour, pulled right from the sea.
So we are basically self-supplied with fresh water.
That's definitely within their best interest to be the most environmentally friendly, because it significantly can reduce the waste on board, the weight that they have to carry, the fuel usage, and it reduces our operational expenses as well.
While we don't know exactly how much fuel Symphony uses, it's been reported an earlier Oasis-class ship, Harmony of the Seas, could burn up to 66,000 gallons of diesel a day. That's the equivalent of 600 cars driving from New York City to Los Angeles. Symphony is more efficient than older ships because of its advanced bubble technology. It releases air bubbles under the hull to help the ship glide more easily across the water, reducing drag and fuel consumption. And engineers like Stig can also capture excess heat coming off 6 engines too.
To heat up potable water, we're heating up the pools, we are heating up the fuel tanks on board.
Those diesel engines also generate all the ship's power.
Which is about the same size as producing power for a little city of about 80,000 people. All the lamps you see throughout the entire ship, all the power supplies on every single stateroom and menus. Then we have all the air conditioning, including all the provisioning plant where we store all the food.
And if any part breaks, workshops hidden next to the engineering room handle it.
We have mechanical workshop, we have electrical workshop, we have workshop for the hotel maintenance team. And parts that we cannot easily get hold of or we need urgent, we fabricate the parts on board.
But crews on board don't just run the ship's grid and engines. There are hundreds of other jobs, from manning the surfer machine and zip lines to entertaining guests. There are ice shows, Broadway-style plays, and an aqua performance. We followed one performer for a day to see how she dazzles cruise-goers every single night.
Hi, I'm Ariana Mazzagatti. I go by Maz here in the Royal Caribbean world. I am the aerialist for the show Hero on the Symphony of the Seas, and I am also the aqua captain.
Royal Caribbean hires serious athletes. They get paid to perform in productions around the world in front of millions of cruise-goers. But the job isn't always easy. Performers work 11 months straight without a single vacation day, and they do it all on a moving stage in the middle of the ocean.
That is the biggest thing to get used to, is the rock of the ship. When you're going to do a jump and you expect the floor to be here, but the floor is here, or the floor is here.
To bring her powerful character to life, Maz is strapped into a 3D flying apparatus that allows her to flip and run above the crowd, with only wires holding her up. Maz is American, and a cast of performers from all over the world. And they're all accomplished athletes, professional slackliners, Olympic-level divers, and world-renowned martial artists. Like many of her fellow castmates, Maz never planned on being a cruise ship performer. On a whim, she tried out for Royal Caribbean her junior year of college, and beat out thousands of others for a spot.
It's as difficult to get into a ship show as it is to get into a Broadway or a West End or a Cirque du Soleil show.
And in 2015, Maz got the call from Royal Caribbean. She dropped out of college and has been performing on cruise ships ever since. After getting a role in Hero, the show's performers head to Royal Caribbean's training facility in Florida. This is where they spend 2 months learning and perfecting the routine. Then they're off to sea. Their stage? The tricked-out Aqua Theater. It's made up of the deepest pool at sea, with a transforming bottom, 30-foot diving towers, a trampoline, and tightropes suspended above the crowd. The new digs take some getting used to.
You're brought from those plain gray studios with mirrors into this, and you're relearning everything because it all changes. The water, the weight of the costumes, the quick changes backstage, the makeup changes, the hair changes. It adds so many new elements that you could not even dream of during rehearsals.
Finally, they're performing live at the 600-person theater.
It takes about maybe 2 or 3 weeks to get into the zone and to feel 1000%. You're not so stressed anymore.
Throughout her contract, Maz and her castmates will do this routine hundreds of times. The performers don't get a single vacation day during their run. Trips home are only allowed in the case of an emergency. They typically perform 8 shows a week. Before any performance, Maz usually hits the gym for about an hour. Then she comes to the theater to run a safety test on the 3D flyer. The flyer is made up of a harness and 4 sets of wires connected to the ship. The technology is pretty complex and can move her on 4 axes. But the tech is proprietary to Royal Caribbean, so we couldn't get too close. After Maz is all set on the wires, she stretches, then heads downstairs to the secret 4.5 deck of the ship to put on her makeup and get into costume. Maz and her castmates do all their own makeup. Once the show starts, Maz stays hidden through the opening. Then she quietly climbs on a platform at the back of the audience, while a crew member straps her into the harness.
The harness is very tight so that I do not fall out. So the pain is necessary. I can't necessarily say you get used to it because every day it might be in a different spot, so you're just bruising a new spot.
The flying mechanism already has a routine programmed into it. So once a crew member hits a button in the production box, she soars above the crowd. While suspended, Maz uses her body to control her flips and spins.
If I get too turned to the front, or if my arm is out of place, or if my chin is forward, it'll send me rocking back and forth like this, and I'll never be able to control it back because it just sends you. And once you get a pull in the wire, it'll just keep going.
But that's not the only challenge. Remember, they're performing at sea. If it's windy, she's blown around.
If it's rocking, sometimes the wires will pull harder on one side, so I have to work around and be able to preemptively move my body in a way that if I know a rock is coming, I have to put more on one side than the other so that I can even out myself with the rock.
All these things affect other aqua performers too. A bob in the ship could affect the balance of a tightrope walker. If it's rocky, where a diver hits the water could be totally different from where they intended to when they left the platform.
If the ship's moving a little bit, rocking a little bit, and the water is going from one side to the other, we call the bridge, and at times, to make sure that the show happens, the captain moves the ship a little bit.
If conditions are too bad, say high winds or a rainstorm with lightning, they'll postpone the performance.
Every day is an absolute adventure, whether that be a difficult adventure, you're tired, we work a lot, we have safety duties that I don't think a lot of people necessarily even realize. We have so many more duties than just coming out and performing.
Now, Royal Caribbean wouldn't share how much performers are paid. In 2019, it was reported that some lower-paid crew members could make around $20,000 annually. Performers get health insurance while they're employed on the ship, and free housing on board. They live in the crew quarters on the lower decks.
We have roommates, so 2 live to a cabin. There are a few who have their own cabin, and then as aqua captain, I get my own cabin.
Royal Caribbean wouldn't show us the crew quarters, but life below deck is well documented on social media. Crews have their own mess hall, grocery store, and even their own dance club. Performers can use the passenger gym, eat at the reservation-only restaurant, and swim in the pools, all things no other crew members are allowed to do.
I will do this until my body physically cannot move.
In 2022, cruise lines were hit with staff shortages. Norwegian and Cunard even had to cancel sailings. Shortages or not, this staff, from the bridge to the kitchen to the waste room, have to move efficiently if the cruise line is going to keep a ship this size sailing smoothly. By the following Saturday at 6 a.m., the captain expertly guides the ship back into the port of Miami. They'll unload everything and everyone and prepare to do it all over again.
Pulling these mossy green threads by hand is the only way to harvest kamte. And after hours of washing, shaping, and drying, they will be transformed into one of South Korea's rarest seaweeds. When Chu Hyun-sung started her business, Padasok, kamte was mainly harvested and eaten raw by locals in the Sosan region. But turning this small industry into a thriving business presented a challenge.
그때는 감태가 뭔지도 모르니까 고객분들이 감태를 구매를 할 생각을 아예 못 하셨던 거거든요.
So she worked to get this earthy and sweet seaweed to people outside the region. Not just to anyone, but to the culinary world's biggest players. All while navigating unpredictable harvests and rising prices.
제가 처음에 감태 시작했을 때는 뭐 감태가 예를 들어서 원물 자체가 1kg에 이건 예로 1kg에 10만 원이다. 즉 하면은 지금은 거의 1kg에 한 30만 원 정도 되거든요.
So how did Chu Hyun take kamte from local delicacy to worldwide sensation? And why is it so expensive?
10년 전만 해도 감태하면 뭐야 도대체 사람들이 감퇴? 막 이렇게까지 심지어 얘기해가지고 제가 되게 좀 속상했었는데 이제는 이제 젊은 친구들도 감태하면은 아 뭔가 고급 레스토랑에서 쓰이는 좀 비싼 거 이런 인지가 생기고.
But before reaching restaurant kitchens, kamte's journey starts on the freezing cold western shoreline of South Korea's Garorim Bay. Unlike other types of edible seaweed like nori that can be farmed, kamte can only grow in the wild on mudflats, coastal wetlands that form when ocean tides wash in sediment and mud.
그러니까 감태 같은 경우는 해조류인데도 불구하고 다른 해조류들은 이제 바닷물에 둥둥 떠서 있는데 지금 보시면 감태는 여기 이렇게 뿌리를 내리고 있는 게 잘 보이거든요. 그러니까 사실 해조류임에도 뭐 야채와 채소 같은 성격을 가지고 있는 굉장히 좀 독특한 해조류라고 보시면 됩니다.
Because of this, kamte can only be harvested by hand. Any other way could destroy the root of the plant, impacting the supply for next year.
채취를 할 때 뿌리는 내버려두고 중간에 끊어서 좀 채취를 해야 나중에 걔네들이 또 자라고 하는 과정들이 있거든요.
Since Comté can go bad if exposed to high temperatures for too long, harvesting happens from December to March, when the sea is the coldest. For these 4 months, Chu Hyun and her team must collect as much Comté as possible to meet demand from buyers for the rest of the year. They can spend 6 hours a day pulling Comté from the mudflats.
그러니까 추운 거랑 물에 잘 빠지는 거, 그 다음에 이렇게 쭈그려 앉다 보니까 정말 늘 이렇게 허리가 되게 아프더라고요. 작업하다 보니까. 손만 시려운 게 아니라 발도 시렸고, 그리고 지금은 안 그런데 정말 갯벌에 칼바람이 장난 아니거든요.
The intense harvesting process is only the first difference between Comté and more common nori seaweed. Compared to nori's dark green colour and slightly coarse feel, Comté's bright green, fine strands have a more delicate texture. This laborious process is just one of the reasons Comté costs so much more than other seaweeds, and relying on the rhythms of nature means supply can be unpredictable.
이게 자연산이다 보니까 이게 안 놔도 제가 할 수 있는 일은 없고 사실은 그렇거든요.
Recently, warming sea temperatures have disrupted the growth.
올해 같은 경우가 굉장히 어려웠는데 지금 좀 등섬 감태가 있잖아요. 그래서 올해는 수확량이 예전에 거의 3분의 1밖에 안 되는 것 같아요.
To make up the difference, Chu Hyun buys Comté from local fishermen who collect it.
지금 저희가 감태 작업하시는 가구는 한 50가구 이상 같이 하고 있어요. 제가 나올 때 좀 매집을 많이 해두는 편입니다.
Comté also has a richer, more pungent flavor than nori.
감태가 굉장히 매력적인 게 되게 달달하면서도 좀 쌉스름한 향이 있거든요. 그래서 달달하면서 좀 쌉스름한 게 다른 해조류랑은 되게 좀 다른 특성이 있는 것 같아요.
But that flavor comes with a price tag. An 8-sheet pack of Comté costs $16. 50 sheets of nori can be bought for the same price. But whether it's harvested by workers or locals, all the Comté has to be washed back at the factory. It's the most crucial part of processing because any mud, debris, or critters left on the seaweed could affect how it tastes in the end.
그리고 얘는 이제 각각류의 새끼 같은 거예요. 사실 이게 자연산이다 보니까 이런 것들이 조금씩 있을 수가 있는데 이제 특히나 저희가 공급하고 있는 데가 파인다이닝이나 호텔이나 이런 백화점이나 이런 쪽이 되게 많은데 컴플레인이 걸리면 절대 안 되거든요.
Years ago, workers would have done this completely by hand, but this washing machine can clean 100 kilograms in less than 10 minutes. It's just one of the changes Chu Hyun made to the Comté processing techniques she learned from her father.
그러니까 제가 이제 회사 생활을 접고 서산으로 내려와서 아버지한테 아빠 제가 감태를 만들어서 팔겠습니다라고 했을 때 아버지가 처음에 코웃음 치셨거든요.
Like many locals, Chu Hyun's father, Chol Soo-sung, grew up eating Comté. But one day, he was struck with a new idea for processing it.
내가 이제 구워서 먹어보고 떠서 이제 보고 하니까 그때도 부가스도 있고 좋더라고. 그래서 그때부터 이제 감태를 시작을 한 거야. 이제 김같이 떠서.
Chu Hyun and her team of 15 still use his techniques to process Comté at Padasup.
그래서 아직도 저는 좀 어려워하고 지금도 아버지한테 틈틈이 배우고 있습니다.
Workers use a technique called harrowing to form the Comté into paper-thin sheets. They submerge a handful of the seaweed in fresh water and mold it on top of a bamboo mat. While it may look simple, this technique can take 3 years to master.
사실 저도 몇 번 연습을 했는데 잘 안 되긴 하더라고요. 쉽지 않습니다, 이 작업이. 또 너무 두껍거나 너무 얇지도 않게 적당한 양을 잘 피는 게 되게 어렵더라고요. 우선은 여기 이제 빈 공간이 없는 거가 되게 중요하고 또 너무 이렇게 뭉쳐 있지 않는 게 되게 중요하거든요.
Chu Hyun uses this press to remove excess water from the Comté.
물이 좀 잘 빠져야 이제 건조가 좋아지니까 또 건조를 오래 하게 되면은 상품의 이제 색감이나 이렇게 질이 조금 떨어질 수 있어서.
The sheets dry the rest of the way in these dryers. Bardar Soup sells Comté sheets either raw or roasted at 230 degrees Celsius for 10 seconds.
구운 감태 같은 경우는 저희가 함초, 자염이랑 참기름, 옥배유 요 세 가지를 부어 같이 믹스해가지고 양념을 합니다.
Bardar Soup produces 3,500 sheets of Comté in a single day and exports roughly 500,000 each year. But carving out a market for Comté outside of Sosan was anything but easy.
저는 저희가 공장을 만들고 감태를 맛있게 만들면 사람들이 알아서 찾아서 사줄 거라고 생각을 했거든요. 근데 제가 창업을 하고 2014년도에는 저희가 매출이 진짜 빵원이었어요.
Chu Hyun knew the only way to create a market for the seaweed was to teach people about it.
그래서 제가 그때부터 했던 게 감태가 뭔지 이걸 좀 알려야 되겠다라는 생각을 해서 감태가 무엇인가, 또 감태는 어떻게 먹으면 좋은가, 감태가 왜 귀한 음식인가, 좀 이런 것들을 알리는 데 많은 초점을 뒀습니다.
She focused on promoting it to the high-end market, sending samples of Comté to Michelin-starred chefs and writing articles describing its unique taste and texture. Eventually, her years of tireless promotion paid off. Chu Hyun says she began getting inquiries from chefs around the world.
그러다 보니까 한국에 대한 관심도 높아진 데다가 제가 만나본 셰프님들은 식재료에 대한 열망이 굉장히 크시더라고요. 특히나 처음 보는 식재료, 다른 사람들이 안 쓰는 식재료에 대한 열망이 굉장히 크셔가지고 감태를 소개해드렸을 때 셰프님들의 반응이 정말 눈이 반짝반짝 하시면서 이런 것도 있었냐라고 굉장히 좋아하시더라고요.
One of them is Chris Cipollone. He's the chef owner of the restaurant Francie in Brooklyn, New York. It's one of several Michelin-starred restaurants that sources Comté through Bardar Soup.
It's got this like robust aroma. It's like an oceanic white truffle, is what I always describe it to people.
Chris has been using Comté in his dishes for the last 10 years. It's a key ingredient in one of the restaurant's signature dishes, conchiglie.
Here we are in the kitchen. We're about to start making our actual pasta, the conchiglie itself, using the seaweed, and we have 4 simple ingredients. We have our semolina flour, we have the gamté itself, we have water, and we have salt. Very simple.
Chris mixes the seaweed into the pasta dough.
I felt like it seasoned the dough to a point where you actually tasted it through the pasta itself. It's got a lot of umami, a lot of pop.
The pasta is then cooked in a buttery wine sauce and topped with clams.
It's right on. Got tons of umami, bright, great mouthfeel, great texture.
While Chris could opt for cheaper types of seaweed, he says Comté's one-of-a-kind flavour is worth the price tag.
Anything's worth it in the pursuit of deliciousness.
And Chris isn't the only one willing to pay. Bardar Soup provides Comté for high-end restaurants in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, as well as Belgium, France, and Germany. But this new demand has caused raw Comté prices to rise. Chu Hyun says since 2020, more producers have popped up.
지금은 감태하시는 분들도 조금씩 늘어나고 또 옛날만큼 많이 나지도 않은 경우들이 있어서 원물가가 굉장히 왔다 갔다 하는데 이거는 아마 다른 해조류들도 마찬가지일 거예요. 그래서 제가 처음에 감태 시작했을 때는 뭐 감태가 예를 들어서 원물 자체가 1kg에 이건 예로 1kg에 10만 원이다. 즉 하면은 지금은 거의 1kg에 한 30만 원 정도 되거든요.
But there is a silver lining. Chu Hyun says this new market for Comté is helping local communities in Sosan.
감태가 이제 많은 분들이 찾아주시고 또 저희도 수매를 많이 해주심으로 인해서 그 어가에서 겨울에 소득을 올릴 수 있는 큰 소득원이 됐습니다. 그동안 10년 넘는 시간 그리고 아버지의 30, 40년 넘는 시간이 그냥 헛되게 보낸 게 아니다라는 생각이 들더라고요.
내가 못한 거 제가 이제 열심히 하고 잘하고 있으니까 좀 마음이 뿌듯해요. 바람에는 이제 우리 송 대표가 노력한 만큼 이제 국내도 그렇지만 이제 해외도 세계적으로 이제 뻗쳐서 이 브랜드를 제대로 만들어서 끌고 나갔으면 하는 것이 바람이고.
Gooseneck barnacles, also known in Europe as percebes, have a long fleshy stalk called a peduncle, which holds the highly sought-after meat you can eat. People say it tastes like lobster, crab, or clam. They grow in intertidal zones, including in Spain, where an average of 5 people die trying to harvest them each year. They also grow here, off the coast of Vancouver Island. The danger of harvesting the seafood begins before Stevie and his partner Jordan even reach the small rock island where the barnacles grow. A 15-minute boat ride off the coast starts off smooth. But wait a little longer and the waves will be thrusting high as Stevie attempts to make the leap from the boat onto the rocks. Stevie's only able to harvest at low tide, when he can access the rocks. He can harvest only as long as the tide will allow him, which is just a few hours a day. Outside of this limited window, the barnacles are covered by water and too dangerous to harvest.
It's not like you have a full 8-hour window to go harvest as many goosenecks as you can. You have this very short window and you're gonna try and capitalize on that.
It's essential for Stevie to do the job fast, but carefully. He harvests while constantly checking the tide. One slip and the waves could take him under.
It just boils down to skilled labor. You know, it's not a job that anyone can do, especially when you're working with a small team of people. You want to have full trust that, both individuals can drive a vessel, both individuals can harvest. You have each other's back out there.
To add to the risks, the most prized barnacles thrive in the most dangerous spots on the island. These ones are denser and packed with meat, and they grow on the edge of the rocks where the waves are constantly thrashing against them. The barnacles here must feed more often so they can grow bigger to withstand the surf, which is how they're able to cling more tightly to the rocks. But this also makes them especially difficult to remove. Stevie uses a leaf spring tool to pry out clumps of gooseneck barnacles.
My uncle gave it to me. He used to harvest goosenecks.
At times, he uses his hands to pull them out one by one. While worrying about his own safety, Stevie must also be careful with how he harvests the barnacles. Harvesters try to avoid taking or harming other organisms attached to the barnacles, and they take extra care not to damage the gooseneck barnacle itself, since slicing through it will automatically lower its value. Marketable barnacles will have a hard white plate at the end that's about 15 to 30 millimeters long. The peduncle should be between 20 and 80 millimeters. At each harvest site in Vancouver, less than 10% of the barnacles will be considered marketable.
I want some with length, It's like, picture a forest. The further you go in and find where the trees are a little bit more protected, the top of the tree is where you're gonna find the branches, and they're gonna have long trunks. So that's the meat that you eat.
As plentiful as this rock island looks, there's a limit to how many barnacles Stevie can take. Once fishers harvest 7.5% of the marketable gooseneck barnacles from a rock, that rock will be closed for 6 months to prevent overharvesting. After Stevie and Jordan return, they transport the barnacles to local restaurants. In Vancouver, they're delivered fresh, since the barnacles degrade rapidly. And if frozen, they'll lose much of their texture and flavor when thawed, making them less valuable.
Say for salmon, you can serve fresh salmon and then you can freeze it and then you can smoke it, and you can push the longevity of that product months. Goosenecks aren't like that.
They're nice and fat.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
The barnacles are graded on an A, B, and C scale, based on how much meat they hold.
Your A's are going to be aesthetically quite pleasing, very full, and then the firmness of meat.
Grades aside, 1.5 to 2 pounds of gooseneck barnacles will typically only yield just over half a pound of meat.
I want to
prepare them as cleanly as possible, which means you can taste all of the flavor that's inside. And for me, it tastes like the ocean. That looks like the head of a dinosaur, doesn't it? With the eye and I always call them dinosaur toes.
In Vancouver, gooseneck barnacles have long been a traditional source of food for the members of the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations. Today, Stevie hopes to sell gooseneck barnacles for $20 a pound. That's about $6 more than the cost per pound of hard-shell lobster. But in places like Spain and Portugal, percebes are considered a delicacy, which is why they can cost even more, sometimes over $100 per pound. Prices are especially high in the summer and around the holidays, when the people there eat percebes most often. As gooseneck barnacles pop up in more high-end restaurants in Canada and the US, the demand could grow in that region of the world. But for now, the value of this crustacean is clear enough to the locals in Vancouver.
This lobster is so valuable that people try to smuggle its larvae across international waters. The ornate tropical rock lobster, or the pearl lobster as it's better known, can cost nearly $100 a kilogram, making it 6 times as expensive as other popular varieties, like Maine lobsters. The colourful crustacean is one of the rarest and priciest lobsters you can find. But what makes the pearl lobster so special? And why exactly is it so expensive? Pearl lobsters are found throughout the Indian Ocean and West Pacific, but the waters around Indonesia are where their largest communities exist. They're known for their blue-green shells, rainbow-coloured spots, and extra long antennae. Pearl lobsters are also meatier and sweeter than other lobsters. In Ikas Bay, Indonesia, they're considered a popular delicacy and sold for a hefty profit.
Rasanya ini yang mungkin membuatnya populer dari lobster yang lain. Rasanya itu agak-agak manis dan gurih, enak, dan kalau digoreng itu rasanya pokoknya mantap dah.
Abdul Kasim has been fishing for lobsters for 29 years. Whenever it's not too windy, he takes his boat to rocky locations that could be home to pearl lobsters.
Kita belajar menangkap lobster ini sejak diajarkan oleh orang tua. Ini kalau kita bilang turun-temurun. Bagian tersulitnya adalah ketika kita menentukan lokasinya. Terkadang lokasi yang sudah kita gunakan itu mungkin di sana habis. Kemudian kita harus mencari lokasi yang baru lagi untuk menangkap lobster.
The fishers leave their nets out overnight and return in the morning. They also catch sand lobsters, but pearl lobsters are worth a lot more.
Seperti kalau harga dari lobster mutiara itu 1 juta, itu kalau perbandingan untuk pasir itu palinglah 500.000. Oleh sebab itu kalau di bulan Januari sampai Februari itu nyampe dia sampai 1.500.000 per kilogram untuk yang alam. Sementara di bulan lain mungkin berkisar antara 1 juta atau 1.150.000 itu saja.
Any lobsters that are large enough to be sold are brought to a seller. Due to government regulations, pearl lobsters that weigh less than 200 grams must be brought to a breeder. Breeders like Merdim raise pearl lobsters in captivity. This method ensures a more reliable supply of lobsters.
Saya tertarik karena hasilnya sangat mendukung untuk keluarga kami, keluarga saya gitu, untuk membiayai sekolah anak saya dan kebutuhan lain-lainnya.
But keeping them healthy is no easy feat. The lobster larvae, or seeds as they're called, are placed in nets that float directly in the ocean, exposed to natural elements. Merdim takes his boat out to feed the lobsters every day. It takes 18 months to fully breed pearl lobster seeds.
Ya memang agak sulit dan agak susah lobster mutiara itu dibudidayakan karena agak rentan penyakitnya, mudah kena diserang penyakit lah gitu, dan terlalu mahal bibitnya juga.
The lobsters are also often attacked by pufferfish and barracudas, who eat their legs. If a lobster loses 2 legs from the same side, it's considered defective and can't be sold.
Ya biasa kita kerjakan, kita lepas 50 ekor. Yang 50 gram itu kita lepas 50 ekor yang satu jaring. Terus sampai pemanenan gitu sekitar 40 ekoran, itu sekitar 10% dah, Mbak.
The surviving lobsters will grow from 50 grams to the preferred selling weight of 500 grams. To help protect their lobsters, breeders check on the nets throughout the week and repair any damage. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it, since pearl lobsters have become one of the most valuable resources at Indonesian fisheries. To help strengthen the country's lobster farming industry, the Indonesian government has banned the export of all lobster larvae. This measure is also meant to protect its wild lobster populations. However, theft and international smuggling attempts of Indonesia's lobster larvae have not stopped. Back in autumn 2022, authorities caught smugglers transporting $2.2 million worth of lobster larvae. The Indonesian government estimates that the country lost more than $64 million in revenue to illegal exports in 2019. The demand for Indonesian lobsters, particularly pearl lobsters, is very high in countries like Singapore, China, and Vietnam. Pearl lobsters aren't even always available in Indonesia.
Tidak juga sih, tidak semua menjual lobster mutiara. Satu, kualitasnya memang dia bagus. Juga yang paling mahal, di atas rata-rata, yang membeli lobster mutiara itu biasanya orang-orang yang pengunjung, pendatang, baik lokal, domestik, ataupun juga orang-orang luar negeri.
Many restaurants and hotels also buy pearl lobsters, driving up the demand and prices. The time of year impacts how expensive a pearl lobster will be as well. Lobsters are more expensive in January and February because of all the Chinese New Year celebrations. Prices are also higher from August to September, when international tourists come to visit. During these months, captive pearl lobsters sell for around $50 per kilogram, and wild pearl lobsters can sell for as much as $75 per kilogram. Wild pearl lobsters are always more expensive because they tend to be larger than their captive counterparts. They also weigh more, even when they're the same size, so there's more meat to enjoy.
Untuk skala rasa, saya lebih memilih lobster mutiara ya, dibandingkan lobster yang Pakistan dan lainnya. Dan harganya juga sepadan dengan rasa lobster mutiara itu tersendiri. Pada dasarnya lobster semua sama, tapi bagi saya mungkin lobster mutiara ini lebih empuk dan enak juga ya untuk dirasa.
Despite the extravagant cost, one of the most popular ways to eat pearl lobster is grilling it as a local outdoor restaurant.
Ya, saya cukup lumayan sering mengkonsumsi lobster mutiara sebulan sekali mungkin, atau sebulan 2 kali. Biasa juga saya bawa ke restoran untuk dibakar, atau saya bawa pulang ke rumah untuk digoreng dengan bumbu sendiri. Lobster mutiara memiliki tekstur yang empuk di lidah dan dagingnya tebal, juga memiliki rasa manis lah.
But despite pearl lobster's popularity in Indonesia and throughout Asia, its price has actually fallen over the years. And its fluctuating value is concerning for the people whose livelihoods depend on it.
Harapan kami sebagai nelayan lobster di sini kepada pemerintah untuk stabilkan harga. Kita cuma butuh harga di sini untuk distabilkan, jangan sampai harganya terlalu anjlok dan drop. Karena kita juga butuh keuangan yang cukup untuk memenuhi segala kebutuhan keluarga.
This welder is holding in his hands a tool that carries as much electricity as a power line. A simple slip could kill him in an instant, making underwater welding the most dangerous job in the world. But it's also essential to keep bridges standing, oil pipes from leaking, and massive ships from sinking. Here in Indonesia, it's one of the highest paying jobs, earning welders up to $15,000 in just 1 week. And they're in such demand that the government is paying to train certified divers to weld. Still, they often work with minimal protection. So why is there so much need for underwater welders in Indonesia? And does paying these workers well actually make up for the risks? Suhendra is preparing to leave on a 4-month assignment. Long trips are part of his job, but this goodbye feels harder than usual.
Pekan lalu istri saya baru saja meninggal. Jangan nakal kamu ya, jangan ganggu adikmu mulu. Nanti kalau kangen telepon ayah sana.
Ganas, saling ganas.
Suhendra has 4 children. Now he's leaving his 14-year-old son Yusuf in charge.
Kangen jelas. Ya telepon sama ayah. Khawatir banget, karena tuh kan di laut banyak hewan buas ya, yang kayak hiu atau yang lainnya. Hati-hati ya. Ya.
Kayak gitu kan, karena ya kerjaan sekali dalam sebulan bisa lah kita menghidupi beberapa bulan kita di rumah lah gitu kan.
Pelan-pelan aja.
Today, he'll be diving in the Indian Ocean by an industrial zone on the coast of Cilegon. He'll be working below a pier that's still under construction, about 1.5 miles from shore. His job is to attach a white box called a sacrificial anode to the iron pillars. The anode is made from a more reactive metal, usually zinc or aluminum. It will rest in place of the column, saving the main structure. The anode has to be replaced every 5 years. There are 900 pillars here, and Suhendra's company is responsible for 471 of them. Suhendra will dive with his mentee, 27-year-old Rangga Ahmed Maulana.
Kalau gugup, khawatir mungkin di hal yang baru, lokasi kerja baru, habit baru gitu.
Diving raises blood pressure, so they need to check their vitals. Still, there's only so much they can prepare for.
Ketika itu ada bahaya gitu kan, ya saya kepikiran anak istri bagaimana kan gitu kan.
This crew sets up the air compressor that will pump oxygen to Suhendra and Rangga. Today, they'll go down with a simple cap and goggles.
Jadi kita anggap sajalah kita ini bertamu ke rumah orang gitu. Kalau nggak permisi gitu kan, jadinya celaka sendiri bagi kita.
Instead of carrying a tank on their backs, the men breathe through this blue tube called an umbilical. It's the only thing tying them to the boat.
Itu biasa terjadi ketika kita kerja tuh di area pelabuhan gitu, area pelabuhan yang keruh-keruh ya. Itu keruh sekali. Jadi ketika kita masuk ke dalam, kalau kita tidak bawa downline atau navigasi khusus ya, itu kita sangat mungkin tersesat.
The anode is lowered with the help of a rope. Suhendra and Rangga communicate mostly through hand gestures while finding the right spot on the column.
Kita bersihkan area yang mau kita las. Kita bersihkan dari barnacle atau penghalang ya gitu.
After about 15 minutes, they strap it to the pillar and start welding. This is where the real danger begins.
Kalau takut sih dari awal sudah takut, karena memang bahaya bermain listrik di dalam air.
The water significantly increases the chances of a lethal electric shock. The rod is charged negatively, and the anode is positive. So electricity will naturally flow from one to the other to complete a circuit. But you need a lot of electricity to melt the rod and attach the box to the pillar. The heat forms gas bubbles that act as shields, stopping the electric current from escaping. If they touch the tip of the welding gun, they'd die in an instant. A shaky hand could cause an accident, and it can be hard to keep a steady grip.
Saya pernah itu arus berputar, saya pernah kena gitu, kelempar. Saya pernah juga terhimpit ketarik arus yang sangat kuat sekali, sering juga.
They wear only 2 sets of gloves and a standard wetsuit. In the US, divers use a lot more protection, but they're still about 40 times more likely to die on the job than the average worker, making this the deadliest job out there. Rangga has been shocked before, but he was lucky he didn't become unconscious.
Mungkin terkejut aja, jadi nggak sampai impact-nya nggak sampai membuat.
Ya dia selalu kasih wanti-wanti lah, artinya wajangan-wajangan biar kita selalu waspada terus untuk kerja di dalam air itu. Karena resiko bisa datang kapanpun dan bisa mengintai.
It takes the divers an hour and a half to attach one anode. They swim up every time they finish one. Pressure at this depth is about twice what it is on the surface. If they go up too fast, nitrogen in their body forms bubbles and blocks blood flow to important organs like the brain or the heart.
Nah itu bisa bahaya juga, bisa menyebabkan dekompresi atau kelumpuhan.
Suhendra visits a decompression chamber every 3 months.
Itu ruangan itu dikasih kompresi tekanan sehingga nanti gelembung-gelembung nitrogen yang tersedia dalam tubuh kita bisa keluar.
The diving has already taken a toll on Rangga.
Sering-sering kita itu pusing, mendadak. Yang paling sering itu kalau memang kondisi pilek menyelam itu bisa sampai keluar darah dari hidung.
The pier they're working on will eventually connect ships carrying crude oil to this brand new $39 billion petrochemical plant that will turn it into plastic. It's part of a big investment push Indonesia is making in the oil industry. The government has offered certain companies up to 100% tax reduction for a decade. They are to build 22 new petrochemical plants by 2025. And this is a business that's expanding across the world. Reports project that by 2050, petrochemicals will account for nearly half of the growth in global oil demand.
We're seeing a huge rush to build additional capacity to produce ever more plastics. And this is not an accident, but it is the plan of the oil and gas industry to continue to monetize as much of a barrel of oil as the industry can.
In the US, petrochemical plants have been the source of major controversy because they emit toxic chemicals that are known carcinogens.
We see enormous releases of toxic pollution.
Human rights organizations have called the areas near the petrochemical plants sacrifice zones. They also pollute waterways. Tiny pellets called nurdles easily slip into drains at factories or sometimes spill out of cargo containers during transport. And they end up killing the fish and birds that eat them. Indonesia is already the 4th most polluted country in the world. Landfills are at capacity. Today, nearly the entire population lives in areas where air pollution exceeds the WHO's safe air standards. That's shortening Indonesians' lifespans by about 1.5 years. The country has launched laws to cap greenhouse gas emissions. But reports indicate those are rarely enforced. Now, experts fear that building petrochemical plants will create more problems.
So the plastics industry has done a good job of convincing the public that the plastics crisis is one of consumer behavior, that the problem is litter, and that couldn't be further from the truth.
The government has promised the investments will create thousands of jobs. And in a country where 25 million people live under the poverty line, surveys have found that many here are more concerned with economic prosperity than with environmental issues.
Saya rasa cuman saya niat kerja gitu, saya niat mencari rezeki, kemudian saya juga bersahabat dengan alam. Jadi alam tahulah mana yang terbaik buat kita gitu.
Yes! The crew is done for the day, but it will take them another 4 months to finish all the pillars. The construction phase alone has employed 13,000 workers so far. Once this plant is completed, it will need 1,000 workers to keep it running.
Saya anggap sih begitu karena memang pekerjaan saya ini hampir jarang orang itu menekuni pekerjaan ini.
Suhendra is looking forward to seeing his children again soon. He says his son wants to do the same work one day. But Suhendra worries that these waters might be too polluted by the time he grows up.
Jadi dulu kakek saya pernah cerita, kita nangkap ikan aja, kita lempar aja ikan sudah dapat kan gitu kan. Coba kita lihat, kita harus agak menjauh dulu untuk cari ikan. Itu tandanya apa? Artinya ekosistem laut kita yang sudah dekat-dekat sudah tidak baik kan gitu kan. Jadi saya gimana ya, jadi laut itu harus kita jaga lah, harus kita jaga bersama. Jadi laut itu bukan tempat sampah juga. Artinya ketika kita bisa menjaga laut, artinya nanti laut ini bisa dinikmati oleh anak cucu kita. Kalau seandainya kita
Salt from Bali's beaches is some of the rarest in the world. It's also some of the most natural. But harvesting it takes patience and a huge amount of strength. Nangapura is 45 years old, and she's one of the last salt farmers here in the seaside village of Kusamba. She spends her days carrying baskets full of seawater and pouring them on the volcanic sand to filter out the salt. But salt farmers make so little that most have left the business for better paying jobs at nearby hotels and tourist spots.
Ada demen kayak gini malih, lagi jadi makin dah nguyah ke bush kan.
We traveled to Kusamba in Bali to see how this salt farming tradition is still standing. Tourists visit Kusamba and nearby regions for their famous volcanic sands. But for Nunga's family, they've been an essential source of income for at least 4 generations. She starts her day at 6 in the morning, leveling sand for about an hour. It's no easy task, even for Nunga, who's been doing this since she was just 15 years old. She and her husband make up to 40 round trips every day to collect water from the ocean. The baskets of seawater can weigh 66 pounds.
Kan teh namun di kedeno makin ke swil menek teka kajeun ke melompat tuh kerugan umai ke teka-tekasan ke.
Even on a calm day like today, it's hard to keep the balance against a swelling tide. So she tries to collect water from smaller waves. After 30 years, she can go back and forth for hours without a break, even as temperatures reach as high as 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The manual labor drove some farmers to replace the buckets for machines that can pump that much water in just minutes. But Nanga hasn't installed one yet.
Menabuh ke kalangan luwung ya sambani gitu terkenal.
This fine volcanic sand sets Gusamba farmed salt apart from other kinds, like that from salt ponds or rock deposits. It absorbs the water fast, like a natural sieve, leaving sun-baked salt flakes on the surface. Nanga is careful to spread the water evenly, because the salt won't crystallize if there's too much water in one area. On a sunny day like today, the water will dry by the afternoon, and she collects it immediately. Most of the tools they use are made from local resources, like this wooden rake. But it's an industry dependent on the fickle weather. Farmers can spend weeks without income during the rainy season between October and April.
Aman hujan nih ke, tandai magai kayak wah mana ke, tanda dijakan.
And erosion is slowly swallowing up this beach.
Makro ka cepot, langsung ajanangan. Di palungan tertegak kini ke, pot kentan ke bah ke kejang, cecek, ulung bayi bana.
Gusamba's beach coastline shrank 32.74 meters in just 7 years. That's nearly 5 meters a year, the second worst rate in this region of Bali. It's forced many farmers to rely on man-made sea defenses.
Nyindirin pangtan ngelompat, iya pasti meriki gitu, angon tanggul gitu.
All this risk and uncertainty is why Nunga's husband has taken a second job in construction, and why the couple doesn't want their 2 children following them into the salt fields.
Panak tiang ni kayak kalian tan gai, nanti pasti dalam tiang nanti pasti, kadang tiang tujuan tu.
Still, Nanga says she enjoys it, and she works hard to maintain the business she inherited from her ancestors.
Demen gai nguyah, sing ada gai len bin ni duen demeni.
Nunga filters the salt in her hut. She uses seawater to flush all of the salt from the sand, and runs it through a filtration system 3 times until the salt is pure. She pours the concentrated salt water into these troughs. They're called balung, and they're what give the salt its name. Traditional ones are made from coconut tree trunks. But Nunga also uses these synthetic sheets that help the water dry faster. This is the only part of the process that she's modernized. More and more, farmers have been switching to these because they're cheaper and don't leak. But farmers like I Wayan Rena think it's important to stick to this traditional palung.
Harus kembali ke palung. Nah, itulah yang disebut organik. Itulah yang disebut alami. Alat jemurnya.
Palung like these can last up to 30 years. This kind of solar evaporation is one of the oldest and most traditional techniques of harvesting salt. In about 1 or 2 days, the water will be gone, leaving behind pyramid-shaped crystals. The natural sea salt is said to be higher in nutritional value than the average table salt, which is often heavily refined. Farmers describe the flavor as subtle and not overwhelmingly salty. And this is the only salt Nunga grew up eating. While Indonesia has one of the longest coastlines in the world, bad weather and coastal changes have affected salt production. Gusamba farmers typically produce between 300 and 600 kilograms of salt a month. But Indonesia imports about 2 million tons of cheaper salt every year, meaning the farmers have stiff competition. Farmers sell 1 kilo of balung dried salt for about $2. That's more than 3 times the price of mass-produced salt sold in most grocery stores, making it a luxury item for the majority of people. That leaves farmers with unsold stock. Wayan leads a network for local salt farmers, and he helps artisans like Nunga sell their salt. Salt farmers have been turning to tourists who are willing to pay for more than just the salt itself.
Yang tamu juga cari apanya yang cari, kan tradisinya. Bukan garamnya yang dia beli mahal. Karena cara pembuatannya masih tradisi.
The decline of tourism during the pandemic was a major setback for them. And without the promise of a consistent livable wage, this generation of farmers could be the last to continue this trade.
Bapak berusaha untuk membangkitkan anak-anak muda. Mulai sekarang mudah-mudahan lah. Kenapa? Karena Bapak ingin melestarikan warisan.
Kusam basalt farmers received a geographical indication certificate from the Indonesian government in early 2022. It recognizes that a product comes from a particular place and has a unique reputation because of that. Farmers hope the international prestige of the certificate will boost export sales.
Nah, Bapak yakin untuk ke depan pasti akan cerah.
Banten katikuangan uyah sambil berusaha dan bang ada nak nyusukin. Kada cak kapang mau nak nyakap, mau nak depang aja. Tadi dah.
South Sea refers to the southern portion of the Pacific Ocean. In these waters, just off the coast of Lombok, Indonesia, pearl farms like Afdol Pearl are growing cultured pearls. These are pearls that require a human to put something inside an oyster instead of harvesting naturally occurring pearls. And South Sea pearls are the most expensive variety of cultured pearls. That's in part because of how long it takes to make a South Sea pearl. While some freshwater oysters can churn out dozens of smaller pearls within 3 months, it takes about 5 years to cultivate a single South Sea pearl. The oyster it comes from, the Pinctada maxima, can only make one at a time. And only a fourth of these oysters survive cultivation. That's why the pearl farmers have to go to great lengths to keep the oysters alive. It starts in this highly controlled laboratory, where lab technicians must create the perfect conditions for oyster larvae to grow into healthy, pearl-producing adults. They have to maintain a room temperature of exactly 20 degrees Celsius and feed the larvae the phytoplankton they need to grow. To do this, they combine salt water from the South Sea and sodium hydroxide and store it for 5 days until there's enough plankton. Lab techs feed the plankton to nets of baby oysters and monitor their growth for about 45 days. That's around the time they reach at least 1 millimeter in diameter and are old enough to be transferred to sea. The oysters are transferred to save on the costs of rearing bigger oysters, which can get expensive.
Ya, kalau pelihara di darat harus kita bikin planktonnya. Kita beli plankton, kita bikin. Itu biayanya agak besar dia.
In the South Sea, the oysters get the warm waters and food they need to mature. But this is also where most of them will die, without producing a single pearl.
Itu yang akan hidup nanti cuman 25.000 dari 10.000 itu. 2.500 maksudnya. Karena 75% itu dia pasti meninggal.
That's why pearl farmers have to check on the oysters monthly to ensure they're still growing, eating, and healthy. They pull the nets of oysters up from the sea and clean the shells. This helps prevent predators from feeding off the oysters and eventually killing them.
Ya, agar ini kadang kalau kerangnya kotor kan ketutup semua. Jadi susah untuk makan. Di sini banyak lumut, banyak kotoran, banyak bakteri juga. Ada ulat di sini. Kadang-kadang itu yang bisa bikin mutiara jelek. Jadi tujuannya juga untuk kita bangunkan. Kadang-kadang kerang tidak mau bangun.
After up to 2 years of nursing, when the oysters are large enough, implantation can begin. For cultured pearls, implantation is the most important step. When a nucleus is implanted, the oyster sees it as an irritant and reacts by building protective layers of nacre around it. This becomes the pearl. Harry is demonstrating where the nucleus is implanted on an opened oyster.
Terus yang ini inti namanya. Jadi sebelum masukkan ini terbuat dari kulit kerangnya.
He tears the oyster's gonads and injects the nucleus in the middle.
He then adds SIBO under the nucleus. SIBO is a mantle tissue cut from another oyster that surrounds the implanted nucleus. It's essential to the pearl quality, and without it, the oyster won't produce any pearls at all. Harry is the only person Afdol trusts with this step. That's because the nuclei don't come cheap. Mahmoud buys the nuclei from Japan, and their cost, in addition to import taxes, takes 20% of his profits. And he says getting import permits for these nuclei is difficult, preventing him from buying enough to expand his business. After the nucleus is implanted, special attention is paid to how the nacre grows around it to avoid a misshapen pearl. They're working towards a large, almost perfectly round pearl. Workers invert the oysters and put them in their protective nets to bring back to sea. The South Sea pearl's unique, soft, satiny luster and thick nacre are a result of the warm waters it grows in. And a thick nacre means a large pearl. Harry says they must flip them regularly so the nacre grows evenly.
Nah, jadi itu tidak boleh terlewatkan dia. Selama 40 hari itu ada schedule-nya. Kita bikin schedule untuk 3 hari. 1 minggu setelah suntik, kita biarkan. Setelah lubang yang kita robek itu nutup, baru kita bolak-balik.
After 40 days, workers remove the oysters from the sea and clean them weekly. Harry checks the implanted oysters monthly to see how the pearl is developing. This is done for up to 2 years before the first pearl can be harvested.
Untuk 3 tahun pertama itu minimal size-nya dari 0,9 atau 0,8 gram atau bisa dikatakan 7 sampai 11 mm. Itu tahap yang pertama, 3 tahun pertama. Itu bijinya itu 1,3 gram lah, minimal 0,8 lah ya.
Harry implants the same oyster 2 more times. Each time, the pearl Afdol harvests is bigger. By the 3rd harvest, the pearl can reach over 20 millimeters in diameter and over 8 grams in weight. But as much as pearl farmers like Mahmoud invest in the intense care needed to raise the oysters, the outcome is never guaranteed. Mahmoud says only 20% of the oysters that survive make the most valuable kind of pearl, almost perfectly round, lustrous and large. Mahmoud grades the pearls based on size, luster, shape and colour. The larger, rounder, shinier, minimally blemished pearls get the highest grade. That can be AAA or quadruple A, depending on the producer. Mahmoud then sells them to jewellers like Rihanna Melia, who fashions the pearls into necklaces, earrings and rings. Rihanna seeks out the highest grade she can find, but it isn't easy.
Sangat sulit ditemukan untuk yang bagus. Saya juga kadang-kadang dalam 1 hari itu, ini dalam sekarang ini, saya minim stok material.
Lower grades are more available, but they're rougher, asymmetrical, and lack shine. And in the jewellery world, those are the least desirable. But even the highest grade pearls are not perfectly round. That's because even though they're farmed, they're still natural pearls. So finding a near perfect pearl, let alone enough to make a string necklace, is extremely rare. It took 9 years for Rihanna to find enough AAA grade pearls to make this necklace. She is finally able to sell it this year for $36,000 to a local buyer. That makes sourcing these expensive pearls worth it for Rihanna, who relies on farmers to continue to produce high-quality pearls. But Mahmoud says pearl farmers need more support from the government, specifically around making nuclei readily available.
Kalau untuk itu sih memang iya, kami bisa tidak bisa pungkiri ya, bahwa untuk perizinan import ini yang agak sulit.
With this kind of support, pearl farmers say they could increase their production and make Indonesian South Sea pearls more readily available internationally.
About 20,000 pounds of sea urchins are delivered to the Santa Barbara factory each week. But it's not until you crack open the spiky shells that you see what makes sea urchins so valuable: the gonads. Just one 200-gram tray of urchin gonads like this can cost $100, and some in Japan can sell for over 5 times that. Sea urchins are one of the few seafoods still hand-harvested by divers today, and in recent years, masses of them have taken over the seabeds of California. So why are there so many urchins? And how, despite this seemingly huge supply, are they still so expensive? Sea urchin, or uni, is a prized delicacy in several parts of the world. Today, the yellow-orange gonads are often served in sushi, and even right out of the shell. Hundreds of urchin species exist, but only a select few are coveted food, including the red sea urchin here in Santa Barbara. Known as California gold, these gonads are prized because they're large, buttery, and sweet from the kelp they eat. To find gonads like this, divers need to collect individual sea urchins by hand. Michael Robertson has been diving for urchins for 15 years. He starts his days early, sailing out before the sun rises. It takes him and his crew about 2.5 hours to reach a good diving spot.
See that little island up there? That's called B Rock. That's where we're going. So all this green right here on top of this red that's reef is vegetation. That's a good thing. That lets us know it's not sand and it's just not bare rock. If there's vegetation, maybe there's urchins.
Michael looks for abundant kelp forests to help him decide where to dive. More kelp typically means better quality urchins.
2010, on a good day, a diver could harvest maybe up to 2,000 pounds a day of good quality sea urchins. Now the divers are typically coming in with about 300 to 500 pounds a day, so a quarter of the amount.
But surprisingly, parts of California's seabeds are full of urchins.
If they wanted to, they could still bring in 2,000 pounds a day. There's a lot of sea urchins out there, but there's a lack of kelp. So even if you bring in 2,000 pounds, if they're not marketable, then we don't harvest them.
If you want to compare how it was to how it is, this was solid kelp from here all the way in, all the way down. And now you have just little pockets here and there.
That lack of kelp impacts the value of red sea urchins. It also strains the ocean's ecosystem and the species that rely on kelp forests for habitat. Along with warming waters and pollution in recent decades, a certain sea urchin is to blame. Sea urchins can survive for years without eating, even without gonads. And after the decline of sea stars, one of its predators, in 2013, the purple sea urchin population exploded, consuming more than 95% of California's kelp forests as it grew. Purple urchins are smaller and produce fewer gonads, so there's little commercial demand for them. And as purple urchins multiply and eat more kelp, red urchins with good gonads become harder for divers to find. Finding the right spot to dive is just the first challenge. Getting your hands on these spiky creatures is the main one.
Some people wonder if sea urchin diving is a dangerous occupation. It can be as dangerous as you allow it. If you don't keep really tight tabs on your gear and the mechanics of your boat, it could easily kill you.
To make the job easier, Michael and his partner Fred need specific tools.
So this is the one essential piece of equipment everybody has to have. It's called a rake. It's custom made. Everybody has their own take on how they like to have it done. I've got all these fancy colors on mine because if I ever drop it, I'll be able to see it on the bottom. And my daughter loves putting the tape on.
Once they're suited up, Michael and Fred head to the bottom and begin collecting urchins one by one.
All right.
Even with the proper gear, a good dive is never a guarantee. Typically, there are only about 5 gonads inside each urchin. And without enough kelp for the urchins to feed on, the gonads start to shrivel up. In some cases, an urchin will be totally empty inside.
We do crack urchins on the bottom so that we can see what we're picking, if there's enough product inside, and what the color's like inside.
To make things more challenging, Michael can only harvest urchins at least 3 1/4 inches in size.
You can't just go out and pick empty urchins. So there's a lot more empty urchins than there is beautiful, packed urchins that you want to sell. Depending on what they're eating, depends on the grade of the urchins.
We got lucky on that one. Oh, right on. Sounds good. Okay, cool, man. See you on the inside there. Roger that.
After a 12-hour day to the islands and back, Michael returns with 750 to 900 pounds of urchins. The shelf life of fresh urchins is short, so they need to be delivered to processors that same night. By 4 a.m., Gene Damachi's team is already cracking and cleaning each one by hand.
And today we probably have about 10,000 sea urchins to go through.
The gonads are extremely fragile, and they only stay fresh for about a week. Workers crack each urchin down the middle to avoid breaking any of the gonads inside. Then it's time for one of the most crucial parts of this process: cleaning the gonads. This stage requires sharp attention to detail. If workers don't totally remove the intestines inside the urchin, the gonads degrade faster. And if any of the gonads rip during this process, they immediately drop in value.
If the gonad breaks, then it drops a grade or two. And when it goes from an A++ grade and we have to drop it down to B grade, the value is maybe about a quarter of what it could have been.
Workers then sort the gonads by color, making sure each tray has a uniform shade of yellow or orange. After they've packed each wooden tray, they use tweezers to inspect each gonad again and gently remove any remaining kelp, shells, or spines. The most valuable gonads make up the A++ grade. Gene sells a 200-gram premium tray like this for $100. These uni are bright yellow or orange and come only from the sweeter male urchins. They're primarily sent to restaurants. But Gene doesn't come by this quality of gonad often. He typically only finds 1 premium gonad out of every 100 urchins. Sea urchin gonads weren't always valuable food in the US, particularly in the 70s, just before Gene's father opened Tradewind.
The government used to ask the divers, the local divers, to smash them, kill them at the time, until a Japanese person came along and said, no, this is actually a delicacy in Japan. And after many trials and errors, we also found out that Santa Barbara sea urchin is actually really, really good, like one of the best in the world.
Santa Barbara urchin was traditionally shipped to Japan until economic collapse stalled things in the mid-90s. Fortunately for Gene's family and other US producers, a sushi boom took off in the US around the same time.
Those of us that was able to make the transition from the Japanese market into the US domestic market survived at the time.
Today, Gene ships his product across the US.
Uni is one of the few seafood out there that they really haven't perfected farming yet. Until somebody figures that out, uni is probably going to be a limited, highly sought after item.
This ultimately raises the price of rare premium gonads.
This year, we're actually seeing a good quality, high quality uni that we haven't seen in about a decade. We're seeing a lot more colder waters. We're starting to see kelp grow back where it hasn't grown back in the last 10 years.
After a difficult decade, things might be looking up for red sea urchins and the kelp they depend on.
Making authentic Tyrian Purple Dye starts here, with extracting a murex snail gland. It takes nearly 45 kilograms of these snails to produce a single gram of pure Tyrian purple extract. It's a painstaking and pungent process. And the result? This single gram of dye that can fetch nearly $3,000. By comparison, 5 grams of a synthetic version sells for under $4. Tyrian purple can be used to dye clothes or create paints.
In the ancient world, it was so rare that only royalty could afford to wear clothes dyed with it. Even today, at such an astronomical price, Tyrian purple pigment is mostly a collector's item. So, what makes real Tyrian purple so hard to make, and why is it so expensive? This is Mohammed Ghassan Nouira. He's been making Tyrian purple dye in his home in Tunisia for 15 years. Today, Ghassan is one of a handful of producers in the world bringing this ancient dye back to life. Ghassan learned how to make this dye through an excruciating process of trial and error. Because there's no instruction manual, he reconstructed the techniques he uses from 1st century texts.
Oh my God, I must say that I have gone through a lot of failures. The historical texts about the process of making Tyrian purple are very rare and are quite vague, so you have to start everything from scratch and learn everything on your own.
To make the extract, Ghassan must navigate a complex process, and it's this extensive labour that accounts for much of the final price. The part of the murex snail that contains the pigment is called the hyperbranchial gland.
The good thing is that the gland is located right under the shell, which helps a little bit in the extraction.
It's the only part of the snail used to make Tyrian purple, and each gland contains only a few drops of pigment. But before he can extract the gland, Ghassan has to wash, scrub, and sort the snails by size.
You don't really want all of this mud and sand to interfere with the dye when you crush the shell and expose the gland. So this is the first step, and it's a very important step. You really have to clean your snails very, very well.
Ghassan can now extract the gland from the clean snails. If he hammers each shell too lightly, it'll take too long. But if he hits it too hard, he'll crush the gland. It took Ghassan 2 years to learn how to do this efficiently.
And of course, the snail is not wasted, then it will be cooked for dinner. Everything is basically recycled.
To make the extract, Ghassan first macerates the fresh glands in cold water and lets them ferment in an airtight container. Once the glands release their colorant, Ghassan gently washes and filters the mixture to separate the dye from the flesh. This is the first of 6 separate rounds of purification necessary to make a pure Tyrian purple extract. Now Ghassan can dry the pigment mixture. He applies it to a sheet of glass and lets it dry under the sun. He uses glass because it won't absorb any of the valuable pigment.
So these glands have been drying for 3 days. They are half dry now. They're still malleable, as you can say. This is the pure colorant, or more or less pure.
Once the pure colorant mixture is dried, he scrapes it off the glass with a razor, making sure to get every last bit.
And the whole process, from the liquid colorant up until the dried pure powder, the whole mass will have lost at least 98% of its weight.
The dry pigment is now purified 5 more times in a grinding and sieving process to remove any detritus. The nearly 100 pounds of murex snails are finally transformed into 1 gram of pure Tyrian purple extract. And acquiring enough snails is another challenge, an expensive one. Ghassan can spend hundreds of dollars sourcing the snails he needs for his dye. That's because finding these snails requires experienced fishers. One of the fishers Ghassan works with is Salim Ben Milad. He harvests murex snails from Solomon Beach. Like Ghassan, Salim and his team have perfected their technique over time.
بالطبيعة لهنا صعيب تحديد المواقع برشا تحت الماء، راهو البحر كبير برشا كما تعرف البحر وكبر ويلزمك تعرف البقايع وتقمر يعني وتشد في مخك. وحتى في الأحجار يعني تحت الماء فما أحجار معين يحبوا.
It can take Salim 4 hours to find the right snails, or he can dive for a whole day to no avail.
بالطبيعة أهم حاجة احنا يعني في خدمتنا إنه يبدأ المناخ باهي يعني وطقس مزيان احنا نقولوا وراكح ويبدأ الرؤية في الماء يعني تحت الماء باية يعني واضحة.
The bloodmouth snail is particularly difficult to catch and requires Salim to dive 15 meters deep, which makes it more expensive. And if the weather is consistently bad, the price goes up even more. Sometimes, conditions force Salim and his team to go a whole month without fishing. But it's out of their control.
اللي يطلبوا غسان للبوغرنو هذا اللي خرجنا منه كما اللي شفنا منه طبعا.
It's dangerous for the snails too, which are highly sensitive to climate change. Since the early 1970s, the population of murex snails has steeply declined due to temperature changes in the water and overharvesting.
We have to be very cautious not to be engaged in overharvesting, to make sure that the small specimens are put back into the sea to preserve the species. So this is why it takes a lot of time.
And careful management of the snail population is vital, as Ghassan and his divers attempt to revive Tunisia's thousands-year-old dye-making tradition. Ghassan doesn't use all the fresh snails to make extract. He reserves some to dye fabric directly. This time, he mixes the snail glands with water and a reducing agent and lets them ferment. The mixture goes from a colourless liquid to green before it turns purple. Finding the right pH balance in this step is crucial. If it's too acidic, the wool may burn, and if it's too basic, it may cause the wool to felt.
So now we're just monitoring the pH. It's about 8, which is perfect.
This is also the moment when the soluble dye is the most light sensitive. Ghassan must cover the dye vat immediately to avoid too much exposure to light. Too much light can turn the dye from purple to blue, destroying a week's worth of work. When the material has soaked for the appropriate amount of time, Ghassan lifts the vat lid, exposing the mixture to light and air. This allows the mixture to oxidize.
And this is how the color will gradually start to develop.
But one round of vat dyeing won't always do the trick. Like with this silk scarf.
It took me like 8 months to produce, and it required like 800 pounds of fresh snails. And this is still not completed.
And it's not always guaranteed that the color will come out the same shade.
Historically speaking, there isn't a single hue or shade of Tyrian purple. It's a range of shades that ranges from the color of clotted blood to the color of red purple.
This range is the result of mixing 3 different subspecies of murex snails. Hexaplex trunculus, which produces a violet blue colour, Bolinus brandaris, which secretes the colour of clotted blood, and the bloodmouth, or Stremonita hemastoma, which releases a rich red purple colour. Tyrian purple dye dates back to the Bronze Age and is named after the Phoenician city of Tyre. Some historians believe it was produced as early as the 21st century BC. Ancient civilizations from Phoenicia to the Carthaginian and Roman empires prospered by producing and trading this dye. One of the production sites was Menings on the island of Jerba, which is now an archaeological site.
لأنها مادة ثمينة جدا، وبما أنها مادة ثمينة فقد قرر الأباطرة الرومان في بداية الإمبراطورية أن لا يقع استعماله إلا من طرف الوجهاء حتى يقع التفريق بين الأشخاص.
A text from the 4th century states that a single pound of Tyrian purple dye costs 3 pounds of gold. But production of this dye came to a screeching halt in the 15th century after the fall of the Byzantine Empire.
دراسة الزيت والزيتونة في أفريقيا الشمالية في القديم، ثم دراسة الأرجوان، هذا صنع الأرجوان المتاجرة به، والرخام إلى آخره، كل ما هو علاقة بالتجارة والموانئ.
Ali says he's grateful that Ghassan is reviving this culturally valuable dye so Tunisians can reconnect with their ancestry. Ghassan learned about the dye at the age of 14 and was enthralled by its history in Carthage. Over a decade later, he found a murex snail on the shore, oozing purple.
My old passion for red purple came rushing from its deep slumber, and I really had this revelation. And this is how my adventure for reviving this legendary dye started.
Now, he hopes to ramp up his production, offering more shades of pigment.